Hey all, and welcome to another detailed tutorial. In this video, I'll step you through the process I used to not only build, paint and weather this awesome storage shed, but I'll also show you how to animate the door as well to add that little bit of extra realism. So let's not waste any more time and get building. This kit is an oldie but a goodie. It's the Walters Co-op storage shed that's been sitting on my shelf for a very long time, as you can probably tell from the state of the packaging. The kit is about as simple as they come, although there are some extra parts that aren't needed, which may cause some confusion. A good set of tools are essential to get the best results. I use good quality sprue cutters with a shallow cutting angle that give a nice clean cut with minimal cleanup. These tweezer style sprue cutters are great for removing excess sprue, further minimizing the amount of sanding and filing that will be needed. The final bit of cleanup is done with a jeweler's file or some sandpaper. Seam lines like this are removed by gently dragging a sharp hobby knife blade along the seam. A small amount of plastic is scraped away each time until you're left with a clean, seamless finish. To reinforce the roof, I'm using some 1mm thick sheet styrene. I trace out the pitch of the roof with a pencil, and using a hobby knife I cut out the roof support. One of the great features when using styrene is you only need to score the sheet 4 or 5 times and the piece can be snapped free. In preparation for painting, I make sure to wash each piece in warm soapy water to remove fingerprints, grease and dirt. Once cleaned, I rinse them under a tap and dry them with a microfiber towel. The roof is the only piece I assemble before painting. For this I'm using a quality plastic cement from the scale modeler's supply and a set of Bachmann adjustable magnetic clamps. To use the clamps I lightly tighten the bolts so there's a small amount of tension, and then I press the clamp onto the roof support and match up the angle. Once happy I further tighten the clamp so it won't move. Now the roof is simply fitted between the clamps and positioned so the edges line up perfectly. Some masking tape is used to further ensure the parts don't move while gluing. Now it's just a matter of applying the glue and pressing the roof supports into position. To make painting easier, I'm attaching some temporary arms to each of the parts I'll be painting. The arm is held using super glue so that it's easy to remove later. The super glue is very brittle, so that when it's time to remove the arm, it will snap away cleanly. Now we can attach the pieces to the paint clips, making painting each piece much faster and cleaner. To prime the parts, I'm using Tamiya Light Grey Fine Surface Primer. And to paint the parts, I'm using a selection of paint that was sent to me along with some other items I'm using in the video from the Scale Modeler's supply. They're an Australian company and have a very nice selection of paints that give a great finish and work perfectly through the airbrush. My compressor is an Iwata Ninja Jet and my airbrush is the Iwata Revolution, a great all-round airbrush. For best results, be sure to use a moisture trap on your airbrush. You'll know when the paint is properly mixed when you can see bubbles on the bottom of the jar. The paint is ready right from the paint bottle, however my compressor is limited to 18 psi, so to ensure there's a nice smooth flow, I further thin the paint at a ratio of 1 part thinner and 3 parts paint. This gave me the best result. These are lacquer paints, so make sure to either use a spray booth or spray in a well ventilated area. When it comes to the interior, I only need to paint around the area where the door will be open. To paint the trim around the windows and doors, I need to mask the walls. It can be a little time consuming, but it's definitely worth the effort once you see the final result. Just remember to apply very light coats of paint so you'll avoid having wet paint run under the masking tape. Here you can see how easy it is to remove the small arms and clean up the superglue. Now it's simply a matter of assembling the model. Nothing too tricky, except you want to try and get the pieces glued on nice and square, so it can be beneficial to use a square or a machinist block, although not entirely necessary, given the model squares itself quite well once all the walls are in position. To add some light rust and weathering, I start with some nice rusty colours from Vallejo. I ended up only using rust and light rust for the roof. To apply the rust, I tear off a small piece of an artist synthetic sponge and trim it to get the shape that will allow me to apply it in the desired pattern. With a small amount of paint on the sponge, I lightly dab it onto the roof. I start light and gradually build up until I have the desired coverage. Avoid dragging the sponge and try to avoid introducing any unnatural patterns. For localized heavy spots, I apply a heavier application of paint with the sponge, and then with a fine paintbrush, I join up some of the spots in the middle. More weathering is done with some weathering pigments. A small amount goes a long way, so you won't need much. Just be sure to wipe away any fingerprints before dusting over the pigments. Fingerprints will be very obvious. With a soft dry brush, lightly dust over the powder in the desired spots. Just enough to show a bit of variation in colour, and where you might see some more or less grime, like around the air vent. The chip paint on the walls is a lot like adding the rust. A sponge is used to apply some Vallejo light mud randomly across the wall. Try to apply it in an uneven application. Have areas of more paint and areas where no paint has been applied. The strips of paint peeling is done using Vallejo SPLINTER camouflage base and applied with a fine brush. Focus on the edge of the wood panels, and having a slightly shaky line is actually a good thing, so I allow my hand to shake slightly as I paint the line onto the wood panel. It's a very time-consuming process, but well worth the effort. The doors are also weathered the same way, and once done they get glued onto the model. Further weathering is done to the door tracks with the concrete weathering powder. And the rest of the model gets weathered with the earth colour powder as well. Now we can start on the door mechanism. The door is controlled by using an Actobotics dual servo controller, which will be driving a micro servo motor. The rack and pinion gearing was designed and 3D printed using Tinkercad to design the model. The ANYCUBIC PHOTON 3D printer was used to print the model. If you've seen any of my more recent videos, you'll notice that I add a lot of details to my models using this printer. Don't worry if you don't have a 3D printer, as all sorts of gears and pulleys can be found online by searching on a website like eBay or Amazon, and they are all quite cheap. You'll probably find all sorts of other uses for the extra gears as well. There are likely hundreds of different ways to make the mechanism for the door. I made this one by using a strip of styrene along with some 1mm sheet styrene for the main door support. The door support is guided using styrene rod and some styrene tubing. An additional guide rail is glued along the top and bottom. Just make sure it doesn't interfere with the door support. The last bit of guide material is a small block at the base. The servo mount is glued in with super glue and only placed once everything else was in place. That way I could position it so the gear was at the perfect distance. Before programming the servo using the servo controller, I remove the gear so it doesn't accidentally open or close the door too far and possibly damage the door. Programming is as simple as plugging in the servo into the controller and plugging in a 5V power supply. Next, press and hold the button in the middle for 1 second and you'll see the red LED illuminate. Now I turn the rotary knob so the servo is fully rotated in one direction and then do a quarter turn back. This will be the closed position limit. Next, I press the gear onto the servo motor while the door support is lined up so the door is closed. Now with the gear in place, I fine-tune the position of the door's closed position by turning the knob. Once happy, I press the button again for 1 second, and now both the red LED as well as a green LED will be illuminated. We can now set the open position by turning the servo controller rotary knob until the door support is in the open position. Pressing the button a third time finishes the setup. The door will now only open and close the amounts that you have programmed, so there is no chance of over-opening or closing, which could cause damage. Just make sure there's a small amount of visible door when it's in its open position. This is where the outer door will be attached. 2 small holes are drilled very close to the edge of the door support, and it's placed back in position. Next, I attach the outer door in the exact position I want with masking tape, and the 2 small rods we cut earlier have a tiny drop of glue added, and then they are pushed through the holes and pressed into the outer door. After a minute or 2, I remove the outer door and add some extra super glue for additional support. It gets placed back onto the model, and the small rods are now permanently attached to the door support with plastic cement. Some adjustment may be needed to the maximum open and closed positions once everything is permanently in place by following the programming steps shown earlier. Lastly, the wires get routed through the bottom of the model. Depending on your layout, the rotary knob can be mounted to the fascia, and servo extension wires can be attached if you need to mount the circuit board at a distance from either the rotary knob or the servos located inside the model. I hope you enjoyed watching, and be sure to subscribe, and if you'd like to help support the channel for more videos like this, don't forget to go and check out my Patreon page. Cheers, and thanks for watching.